Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague, the honourable member for Whitby, both for his speech and also for sharing his time with me. I'm honoured to stand here on the traditional territory unceded of the Algonquin Nation and say meegwetch. It has been a somewhat frustrating debate, as many speakers have noted. There is unanimous support in this place for Bill C-30, and yet there are things about which we want to debate. For my part, I'd just like to say that why do I support Bill C-30? Well, Canadians need help. Raising and doubling GST and the GST rebate, that is, the rebate that will go to lowest income Canadians, will amount to $2.5 billion in total, and it will reach, in small amounts, 11 million Canadians. That's not something to sneeze at. People want help. And as my honourable colleague from Vancouver Kingsway said moments ago, $500 is not a small amount of money when you're really up against it. It will make a difference. That's why I will vote for this. And we also have Bill C-31 that will provide a one-time only to low-income rental, $500 to help low-income renters, as well as beginning the really important work towards including dental care in our healthcare system, an idea originally proposed by the Green Party of Canada. So there's nothing not to like in this bill, but there's much to talk about because it doesn't address really large problems like what happens if we go into a recession? What if this inflationary problem isn't solved by what the Bank of Canada has done in raising rates and in the rate hikes, which have been quite dramatic? What if the rate hikes push us into recession, which is a reasonable thing to ask since that has happened many times before. And as a matter of fact, according to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives economist David MacDonald, every time over the last 60 years rate hikes have been used to address inflation, recession has occurred. C'est une situation tellement difficile parce que nous avons maintenant...
We're dealing with a new situation, and we have to deal with international crises, the climate crisis, the pandemic crisis, the climate change crisis, and of course the crisis due to the war in Ukraine.
Debate in this place, and for obvious reasons, political parties want short, simple, bumper sticker solutions that convey support for their party by being definitive, by being clear. It reminded me so much, the debate in this place over Bill C-30 or Bill C-31 reminds me of a somewhat famous quote from H.L. Mencken, a great journalist, who wrote, quote, "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." And we see that here so often. I mean, what we hear, and I'll say what the complexities are and how they're not respected in this debate. This is not something where you can say, this is a simple problem. Even inflation in its traditional sense isn't really simple. But this isn't simple inflation. We have many factors. We had thought initially that if we saw inflation in some prices of goods post-COVID, it would be the response to the pent-up spending desires of Canadians who were not able to spend because COVID kept people from enjoying themselves, basically. The same thing happened after the Spanish influenza epidemic in the early part of the 20th century. The roaring 20s were a response to a very dismal period of people being locked down and massive deaths in the millions from Spanish flu. We also were told, well, look, we're going to see some initial inflation, but it will be transitory and short-lived. That seemed to be holding true until February, when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, that led to different costs and real costs rising because of the enormous impact it had immediately on the price of oil. And then climate impacts. Climate impacts are inflationary. It's important for my friends across the way to recognize that climate impacts have increased drought, have increased food prices, have increased the high price of some specific ingredients that make a difference in our shopping carts. All of these things combine to create what we're now experiencing in higher prices. So the response that we get to this is, in terms of the interest rates, we also have a debate in this place about, well, look at how much money the Liberals spent in dealing with COVID. They were just printing money. I would say to my Conservative colleagues, I have no doubt that if Stephen Harper had been Prime Minister through pandemic, he would have done exactly the same things that the current Prime Minister did, because every economy in the G20 followed the same playbook. Every economy in the OECD was taking the same advice. Central bankers were using quantitative easing. That's a term I learned actually from the great former finance minister Jim Flaherty, who used quantitative easing. We were doing exactly what all the other economies around the world were doing, virtually zero interest rates and quantitative easing to create billions and trillions of dollars of money flowing into the global economy to confront the pandemic and to try to save lives. So these were complex issues for sure, but they're simplified. So what I hear from the Conservative benches as we debate C-30 is that inflation and the pain we're undergoing, to which C-30 provides a Band-Aid. A Band-Aid is good when you're bleeding, by the way, but it's not a long-term solution. Bill C-30, in this debate, we've been hearing from the Conservatives that all the pain that Canadians are experiencing is through the failures of the current government, that inflation is the fault of the current government, that global supply chain problems, the fault of the current government. I suppose the war in Ukraine, and by extension, since that's been the proximate cause of the biggest price hikes in terms of energy supply, due to the fault of the current government. Disproportionately in this debate, the Conservative benches want to blame a very small increase, a 2 cents a ton increase in the price of our carbon pricing that affects only some provinces. That's been a major, well, we've heard it. We've heard it more than 3 times, what that impact is, right? It's minuscule in the context of what we're experiencing and the real pain Canadians are feeling. Now, the simplification on the Liberal side is to say, well, just compare us to other countries. We're doing so much better than other countries. For instance, by the way, we talk about our debt to GDP ratio. It's just looking at the U.S. debt to GDP ratio. It's over 100%. So we are doing better than the United States by quite a lot. But if you're a single mother and you're trying to buy groceries, you really don't care that overall Canada's doing better on our debt to GDP ratio. That's not top of mind. You really want to know that somebody's got your back, as the Liberals like to claim they do. So both camps, to varying degrees, have oversimplified the problems we're facing. And in doing so, I think we don't adequately respect the intelligence of thoughtful Canadians who are more than prepared to understand that this is a global problem and that we're not the only country experiencing inflation. In fact, some of the countries that are experiencing inflation much worse than ours have no carbon price, haven't gone through the same policy instruments. This is not a specific problem for which we can blame the Liberals. I will blame the Liberals for many things, but I can't blame them for this inflation. So when we look at what this is, I want to refer my colleagues to a book that I think is prescient and worth looking at. It came out in 2005. It's by James Howard Kunstler, who's a best-selling author, but the book was called The Long Emergency: Surviving Converging Catastrophes of the 21st Century, in which he pointed out that when the price of gas and the price of oil becomes constrained by real events, that's going to mean that we have a real challenge to what we presume to be our right to a certain standard of living, to a certain lifestyle, for lack of a better word. When we look at the real costs of everything, and I'm going to quote here Andrew Nikiforuk writing in the Tyee and referring to the long emergency, quote, "Since April 2020, the cost of oil has climbed 5-fold. The price of coal, the cheapest of fossil fuels, hit new highs of nearly 150%. These are real costs that really affect prices. So what do we need to do if we're serious? We need not Band-Aid solutions, long-term solutions, anticipating that we may well be in a recession. Let's look at a wealth tax. We need to go back and look at a general wealth tax, but specifically, let's look at a windfall tax on oil and gas profits. Oil and gas profits, due to the war in Ukraine, have posted unbelievable gains. I've come to the end of my time, Madam Speaker. We need to tax back.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member from Saanich Gulf Islands for her intervention today. You know, she brought up a really interesting point, which is that the Governor of the Bank of Canada had made predictions regarding inflation, and then something else was thrown into the wrench. I don't think it's fair to assume that the Governor should have known that a war in Ukraine was going to break out. But the narrative that always comes from the Conservatives is, well, the Governor of the Bank of Canada said that this was going to, one thing would happen, and another thing happened. He's wrong, therefore he's to blame. Would she agree that you know, given the fact that the Governor couldn't have possibly known that a war in Ukraine would break out, or what the sanctions would be and hence the impact of it, that he is indeed not to blame for the fact that he may have got that wrong?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank my colleague from Kingston, the Islands. Obviously, no one can blame the Governor of the Bank of Canada for assuming that it was situation normal. It's not situation normal. I remember the previous Governor of the Bank of Canada, Steve Paulos, while testifying to the Finance Committee, when asked, are you worried about the inflationary impact of the government using quantitative easing? He said, I remember, quote unquote, he said, oh, inflation, that's a problem I'd love to have. I'm worried about deflation. So the best and brightest folks, and they are really bright folks, didn't think that inflation was going to be a problem, and if it was, it would be temporary and short-lived. And we saw the price on some things go way up and the price on other things fall. So it isn't conventional inflation, and it never was.
And comments? The Honourable Member for Sarnia Lambton.
And I'd like to thank the member opposite for her speech. Now, Conservatives will always support lower taxes, and that's why we are supporting C-30. But my concern is that, with one hand, the government is giving a few $100s back to Canadians, but with the other hand, they're actually taking that money away by increasing payroll taxes, the carbon tax, and by continuing to spend in a way that financial experts are saying is, you know, fueling the inflationary pressures we're seeing. Would the member agree that this temporary Band-Aid is really not going to fix the problem?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to my friend from Sarnia Lambton. We may not agree on exactly what the problem is. I can agree that the temporary Band-Aid isn't going to fix it. But I was just on the point before closing, Madam Speaker, and if I can, the profits that big oil is getting right now, which are off the charts and are really contributing to pain for Canadians, are essentially war profiteering. Their profits are solely due to the war in Ukraine. The Parliamentary Budget Office has said if we increase the tax temporarily on the profits of big oil from 15% to 30%, that would be $8 billion that could be distributed to Canadians who need it most. Let's get in a guaranteed livable income.
The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Thank you, Madam Speaker. For a while now, we've been talking a lot about household purchasing power, and its reduction comes from the drastic increase in fossil fuels and other combustibles. In the future, there will be policies to fight against climate change that will increase the price of a number of very polluting goods. I wonder if it's not today a ripe time in this inflationary crisis to think about long-term solutions so that Canadian and Quebec households, and so that households out west as well, become less vulnerable to these changes. Perhaps the current crisis could inspire us to be constructive in the long term. What solutions does the MP for Saanich Gulf Islands have to suggest? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Thank you to my colleague. 1,000 thank yous, because we have to think and be ready for the issues of the future, the heat waves and deluges and floods of the future. In my province of British Columbia, there are over 700 people who died last summer because of climate change. and heat waves, but we are yet to be ready to fight against catastrophes and disasters, which also harm our economy. We have to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuel industries. We also have to plan for the termination of the production of fossil fuels in Canada with a plan to protect our community and workers. It's a long list.